Hello, and welcome to our lecture on literals, identifiers, and naming conventions. Now, in this video, we're going to identify what these are, and we're going to look at some rules and conventions for naming variables, methods, classes, interfaces, and all of that. Now, what is a literal? We could define a literal as a syntactic representation of data. Anything that has some meaning, that represents some physical, maybe quantity or entity. For example, I have here 87. This actually represents something to you. 89.8. 250L, which is 250. Just L there just specifies, just explicitly specifies it is a long. You have a character literal here, you have a string literal here. And what you actually use, the data that you actually be using in your programs are literals. And when you create these literals, you're going to assign them to variables to store them and use later on. There's no doubt, if I wanted to do an on-the-fly calculation of maybe 5 times 5, I could go ahead and use the literals directly in my program. But if I have to reference them later on, then I need to create a variable and store them in. So literals are all of the things you're going to see in your code, like this, whatever, string, characters, all of that. Now, this, what I've put here, you see 100 million. It's the same as this. As of Java 7, you can actually add underscores like this for better visibility, like to better visualize. I mean, it's difficult to read this when it's so chalked up like this, but when it's in this form, normally if we were writing it down, we would use commas to separate. But Java will not permit you use commas to separate for better visuals, but instead you can use underscores, and it's simply just gonna wipe off the underscores and use the value like this, the literal like this. We'll see that shortly in an example. Now, when we declare a variable, for example, here I declare a variable letter of type char, and I assign a literal to it. And later on, I can now use this variable to reference this literal and use it in my program somewhere. So you create a variable, you assign a literal to it if you want to later on use that literal to do something else. Okay, that's it. Now, what is an identifier? An identifier is a symbolic name given to a variable, a method, a class, a package, or an interface, or anything that you're going to name in your program. We're going to see all of these as we go along. For now, we have only seen variables, we have written a few methods, and we have written a class, but we have not gone into the details of explaining all of that. But identifiers are what you're going to be using to name them. For example, I want to name my variable. We had some names like age. Here we have grade, letter. You could call it anything. All you need to do is follow some rules that we're going to see on our next slide. Like earlier, I said you cannot use Java keywords for any other thing. This is one of those things you need to be careful with. You cannot use a Java keyword to name your literals. Sorry, to name your identifiers. So in this example, I have public class welcome. Now, what are my identifiers in this short program that I have here? I actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 identifiers that I have written in this program. The first one is an identifier for the name of my class, which is welcome. The next one is an identifier for some variable called grade, which will probably be the grade that you give to maybe students or people taking a course. or people after an activity, you want to grade them. And the next one is letter, which is just one letter of the alphabet. I've just added static there. That's another way. In this case, it's a class variable. Like I said, we'll talk about class variables later on. And down here you have main, which is an identifier used by Java to declare where to create a method where your Java program will start. And then you have args here, which is actually an array of strings. We'll talk about command line arguments later on, and we'll talk about these. These could be anything. It could be str, it could be any name you choose, but it should follow the rules. Now, with that said, like the definition goes, an identifier is a symbolic name given to variables, methods, classes, all of those things that you're going to be creating. And on the next slide, we're going to look at some rules that you should follow when naming identifiers. The first rule is an identifier cannot be a Java keyword, which means you cannot use public. There's no doubt you can use capital public because it's different from the keyword Java public, which is lowercase, but that would be bad practice because it might just be confusing. So anything that's related to that or that looks like a keyword, whether you change the keys or not, don't use it. Just look for something else. I mean, there are many words out there. You could look for any name. Just make sure you look for a name that is meaningful. For example, if you're storing ages of people, it's good to name a variable age. If you want to store the scores of students, it's good to name the variable scores. If you store so that when somebody sees it, immediately you look at it, you get an idea of what you expect to be put inside there. Now, identifiers are case sensitive. If you define, I remember saying Java is a very case sensitive language, which means if you define age with capital A, then when you want to use it later on in your program, you must ensure it is referenced using the same case you used in declaring. Otherwise, Java will tell you it cannot find the variable. Identifiers can only contain special characters. This can only contain the special characters underscore or a dollar. Special characters, when we talk of special characters, we're referring to things like equal, the percent sign, the point, the comma, all of those kind of things. You cannot use them to name your identifiers. One of the reasons is these characters actually have special meaning. You're going to see them. Some of them are operators. Some of them are used in regular expressions. They have different meanings. And if you use them in your programs, it's going to try to do something else. Java understands them to mean something else. So you don't use them in naming your identifiers. The only special characters that you are permitted to use when naming your identifiers is the underscore or the dollar sign. Now, the next rule, identifier should never start with a number. If you start to name an identifier with a number, the Java compiler is going to complain. And down here, you should not add spaces when naming identifiers. Like down here, you see I said something, a variable. Well, I have some good identifiers and bad identifiers. Our first rule says cannot be a Java keyword. So you cannot use something like static or abstract, which are Java keywords. It's going to complain. You could use something like abstract with capital A because now Java is case sensitive, and abstract with a capital A means something different from abstract with a lowercase a. But don't do that. It's just not good. Look for a better variable name or a better identifier name. You cannot use a special character like the exclamation point that you see there. It actually means something else in Java. Not. You cannot use the percent sign. It actually means something, modulus. So you don't have to start your variable names with a number. Identifier names, you cannot start them with a number. You can, however, start them with a $, with an underscore, with any other thing. Variable names can very well contain, or identifier names can very well contain numbers, but the rule is it can never begin with a number. So you want to keep all those rules in mind. We're going to look at a few examples after this last slide to better explain that. Now you have this is an extremely super exaggeratedly long Java identifier _90. That's legal, but I mean, it's unnecessarily long. That's just boring. You can look for a better shortened, meaningful name to identify whether it is a method, a variable, a class, whatever you're creating. Now, on this last slide, I have some conventions, like what we saw on the previous slide are actually rules. If you don't follow them, the Java compiler will not let you go through. But with the conventions, it's a very broad world. You're writing code today, you don't know who's going to be reading your code tomorrow. You yourself, you might just come into your code in the next 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years, and you will just be lost if you did not organize things properly. So there are some some guidelines to create identifiers. We call them conventions. Like I said, they are just conventions. They are not rules. If you don't follow them, it's going to be fine, but it's going to make life difficult for some other person reading your code, or maybe difficult for you tomorrow when you come back to read the code. They are conventions, so every Java programmer is following them. Just follow them. You find yourself sharing code when you work in teams and so on. You don't want to start doing things haphazardly. You want everybody to follow certain standards. Now, I got this list. I copied this list from this website. I just found it interesting. I copied them there. It says the first rule, it has conventions, not rules. Class name. A class name should start with uppercase and be a noun. For example, string. We have been using string before. That's a class. You have color, button, system. You've seen system, thread. Those are all Java classes. And we're going to be using them a lot. You could also, there's one thing I forgot adding there. It would be a good idea if you have a class name. Okay, we'll talk about that down here. It's good, I can see it there. Now the next one, interface names. Interface names should start with uppercase letter, same as the class name, and must be an adjective. You want to name them as adjectives. Like they are. We have some examples here. Runnable, remote, action listener. Maybe if you were dealing with shapes, you want to name an interface as drawable, things like that. Now, there's a rule. Oh, no, I keep on saying rule. There's another convention. When your class name or your interface name has multiple words, then you should capitalize the first letter. It's usually referred to as camel case. Like here, you see action listener. It has 2 different words. So the first letter of every word is capitalized. Don't use spaces because that will give you an error. You can't use spaces in an identifier. Don't use underscores because, well, you could use underscores, but just follow the convention. Somebody else might. Most of the people you come across are following the convention. So why do you want to be exceptional? You could be exceptional in something else, not by breaking the rules. Now you have for methods. Method should start with a lowercase letter and be a verb. Methods are actually action words. They do. Methods represent what your program can do. So those are actions, the activities that your program can perform. So you want them to be action word. Like these are inbuilt methods when we look at swing. We're going to see this action performed, for example. And you see, it starts with a lowercase for the first word. In cases where you have multiple words, with the class, we said you should capitalize the first letter of each word. But with the method, the first letter of the first word, that the first word is always lowercase. And after that, if there are more words like action, perform, code finder, whatever you choose to name your method, average calculator, whatever, or average resolver, whatever you choose to name your method, the second word or any other word should be capitalized. Now, variables should start with lowercase, and if you have more than one word in your variable name, then all the other words should begin with a capital letter. Same as for methods, but you will realize that the difference is methods always have parentheses. We'll talk about that later. And then you have package names should always be lowercase. We're going to be seeing some default packages, and we're going to define our own. For now, you don't know what packages are, but I'm going to talk to you about all of that. And then constants should be uppercase. Remember when I defined gravity, pi, and the rest. Immediately you follow these rules. Immediately you follow these conventions. I don't know why I keep saying rules. The rules were on the previous slide. Immediately you follow these conventions, your code becomes easy for people to understand. Like, they are conventions, they are worldwide, everybody is using them. So when I take your code today and I start looking at it, I simply understand very quickly what's happening. Like when I see something in capital, hey, it rings a bell, this is a constant. I'm using somebody's code, this is a constant. I should be very careful. I should not start trying to change it. If you create it in lowercase, somebody will only try to change it and later on realize, whoa, okay, it was defined as a constant, so I can't do that. But if you did it in capitals, then the person should immediately think, or it should immediately occur to the person that it is a constant, except the person is good at not following the rules of the game. Now, you can also get more details about all of these rules and conventions on the Oracle website. I have the link here. I would recommend you go there, read it, go through it over and over again. It's going to be helpful. Now let's go to our program and write a few annoying variable names or identifier names and then see what it does. So this is what we had earlier. I'm just going to take all of these off. I'm going to take all of this off. I don't need that. And now I can say int my score. First thing, do not put a space. Now it's saying int my, the variable is my, but from here onwards it's confused. So if you want to do that, you should say my score, for example, and that is fine. You don't want to represent something like int first student age. Bad practice. Do not name identifiers with, do not begin identifier names with a number. It's not going to work. You could, however, use a dollar, and maybe you could add a 1, and now you're good to go. You could use an underscore. You cannot use a special character like that because it has a different meaning. You cannot use a special character like plus. You cannot use a special character like plus or minus or bracket closed, whatever. You can't do all of that. Immediately I do that, you're going to see it shows me the red line, so I don't necessarily need to compile. If you are Thomas, let's compile and we get an error because there is a problem. And just make sure you follow the rules and the conventions that we have listed out there. And like I said, with conventions, if you don't follow them, nobody's going to beat you. If I put a space here, I have an error because that's a rule. You cannot use space in identifier names. But if I decide to change these to all capitals, then fine, my program would not have any issues. It's just going to work fine, except that somebody looking at it for the first time, like, this is the rule, this is the convention for naming classes and interfaces. Now, when I see something starting instantly with a capital letter and it's like that, I might be tempted to think it's not a method until I go further and now see, oh, there are parentheses. So just follow the conventions and life is going to be great. Now, if we run this again, we don't have any output, but yeah, we're good to go. So let's leave it at that for now and see you in the next video.